My father dipped into my little girl's college savings to purchase a jet ski for himself. When she broke down in tears, he shrugged and told her, "That's life, sweetheart. It isn't fair." I soothed her as best I could, and that very afternoon we packed up and left my parents' house forever. By the following dawn, an envelope from my attorney was already en route, and soon afterward my father would learn the true cost of his impulse. I can't recall his exact first words. What remains burned into memory is the instant my daughter's expression crumpled as he swaggered into the kitchen wearing a garish crimson life jacket, swinging a jet ski key fob like a prize he'd won at the county fair. She was perched at the table, bent over a practice worksheet from one of the secondhand college prep workbooks I'd picked up at Goodwill. All week she had been grinding through mock application essays, forcing herself to concentrate, clinging to the belief that her future still existed even though nearly everything else had been swept away. 3 weeks before, floodwaters had swallowed our home, not merely the structure, but every trace of the life we'd built inside it. Her crayon masterpieces that once lined the hallway. The battered guitar her father had played until cancer stole him from us. We fled with nothing but the clothes on our backs. She kept wondering aloud whether the shoebox full of letters she'd written to her dad was still bobbing somewhere in the muddy current. I never found an answer for her. With no other options, we moved in with my parents. At first it seemed like mercy. Actual beds, a solid roof, hot showers. Yet by the second week in the atmosphere curdled. My mother began sliding chore lists across the counter, laundry rotations, dinner duties, requests for grocery money. I was pulling shifts at the diner just to keep gas in the tank and lunch money in my daughter's pocket, but no effort satisfied them. Mom exhaled theatrical sighs whenever my child reached for the milk carton. Dad muttered about the spike in the electric bill caused by 2 extra bodies. One night, I lay awake and heard them whispering in the corridor that we were mooching. They never realized I could hear, but we stayed because I had nowhere else to go. I repeated to myself that it was temporary, that I could stomach it, that every sacrifice would matter once we were steady again. I clung to the $15,000 I had scraped together for her higher education, birthday cash, tax returns, every overtime hour, and skipped meal funneled into that account. It was my solemn vow to her. That vow exploded the morning my father burst in grinning like a kid who'd raided the cookie jar. He babbled about weekend lake trips, bragged about the steal he'd scored, insisted you only live once. He dangled the key and asked if we wanted a look. I thought it was a prank until my mother added, "Well, that cash was just moldering in the bank anyway." My insides turned to ice. I demanded to know what cash they meant. She stared at me as if I were dense. The college fund. They had drained it, every cent, without a word of permission. Dad declared they had earned it for putting us up rent-free for weeks, that groceries, water, and washer cycles added up, that we ought to be grateful. He actually chuckled and told my daughter, "That's life, sweetheart. It isn't fair." The light went out of her eyes. She had surrendered so much without ever whining. I watched her fight to hold herself together, but when the tears spilled anyway, I didn't hush her. I simply crossed the room, took her hand, and guided her upstairs. We stuffed our few belongings into 2 duffels and a plastic bin that still smelled faintly of river water. I offered no farewell, no explanation. I texted the one person I swore I'd never need again, my big brother. We hadn't exchanged words in years after some mysterious explosion with our parents I was never privy to. I used to think he was overreacting. That day I finally understood. His reply came in seconds. One word, "Come." We reached his doorstep near midnight. He flung the door open before my knuckles touched wood. My daughter hurled herself into his embrace as though she'd known him forever. He settled her into a spare bed, poured me coffee, and waited until sunrise to ask questions. When morning came, he only wanted the amount. I told him. He nodded once and said, "I know someone." That same afternoon, a certified letter from his attorney left for my parents' address. By the next day, they would discover the jet ski carried hidden fees. When my mother finally phoned, the envelope had already landed. She skipped hello and tore into me about shaming the family, twisting facts, weaponizing lawyers over what she labeled a trivial mix-up, branding me spiteful. I held the phone at arm's length until she needed air, then spoke a single sentence. "You robbed your own granddaughter." Dead silence swallowed the line, as if the call had dropped. Then she disconnected. My brother was leaning against the kitchen counter sipping coffee when I set the phone down. He didn't ask what she'd said. He simply pushed a folder across the granite. Inside lay copies of everything his lawyer, Beth, had already submitted. I gaped at the legalese: unauthorized transfer, fraudulent impersonation, compensatory damages, terms I never dreamed I'd aim at my own mother and father. Beth wasn't the hand-holding sort. She delivered facts cold. When I asked if we honestly stood a chance of recovering it all, she didn't soften the edges. You'll get the 15 back, and thanks to the stunt they pulled at the bank, likely another 10 on top. I had braced for the original sum at best. Hearing her state it so matter-of-factly cracked something open inside my chest that had been clenched for weeks. That afternoon my daughter laughed with her cousins in the living room while my sister-in-law, Lacey, showed her how to string neon beads into bracelets. Children's voices rang through the house in a way that felt almost illicit after the stifled quiet at my parents'. My girl kept flicking nervous glances my way, waiting for someone to scold her for enjoying herself. I answered each look with a tiny nod. You're safe here. My parents didn't stay silent long. 2 days later my father's texts began flooding in, long, wounded paragraphs insisting I cease the absurdity, claiming I'd blown everything out of proportion, warning that I was tarnishing his standing among the lake crowd. Then, almost comically, he threatened to countersue me for emotional duress. My brother barked out a laugh when I read that line aloud. We ignored every message. Beth simply filed the next round of paperwork, calm, precise, undeniable. A formal demand for full restitution plus damages, complete with a hard deadline and notice that failure to comply would escalate matters. That very evening my mother appeared in my brother's driveway, clutching a plate of banana bread like a white flag baked in butter and sugar. She hammered the doorbell 5 urgent times. My brother answered. I lingered out of sight in the hall. Through the sidelight, I watched her plaster on the saccharine grin she used on people she hoped to charm. Extend the plate. He barely looked at it, spoke a few clipped words, and shut the door. She stood frozen a moment, then shuffled back to her car. Hours later, once the house was still, my daughter asked if we would ever live with Grandma and Grandpa again. I gave her the honest answer. No, honey, we won't. She accepted it without argument and returned to lining up her dolls. I waited until she was asleep before I finally let the tears come. The following morning Beth rang with fresh developments. My parents had retained counsel. Their attorney proposed a settlement, $5,000 in exchange for my signature on a gag order, keeping the entire mess secret from the rest of the family. My brother listened to Beth read the terms, snorted, and shook his head. No chance. We sent nothing back, not even a polite refusal. Silence was the next move. It began quietly. Unknown numbers leaving voicemails. Then my cousin Melissa, whom I hadn't spoken to since her baby shower, left a hesitant message saying Mom had phoned her spinning some preemptive tale before rumors got out of hand, wanting to know if I was truly suing. I let it sit unanswered. That afternoon Beth requested bank security footage and phone records of the supposed authorization call. She already suspected what she'd find. Nothing. 3 days later my father showed up at my brother's office, strolling in as if 5 years of silence had never happened. My brother instructed the receptionist to summon security. Dad never made it past the lobby. That same night, he posted a sprawling Facebook manifesto about ingratitude, betrayal, greedy relatives who valued money over blood. He implied I'd been manipulated, that I was letting dollars sever sacred ties, that he had only ever tried to aid his children even when they proved unworthy. Comments poured in from distant aunts, former congregation members, neighbors I hadn't thought about in decades. A few slid into my private messages asking for my version. I left them on read. The only person I answered was Aunt Laura. Her message was one line. Tell me what really happened. I won't take sides. So I laid it all out. She went quiet for hours, then posted beneath my father's rant 2 simple words. You lied. The thread detonated. My mother countered the next day with her own lengthy defense, painting herself as the martyr who had sacrificed everything only to be exploited, recasting the theft as fair reimbursement, labeling the lawsuit an assault on family itself. I stayed off social media entirely. Beth called that afternoon, sounding almost gleeful in her fury. The bank had coughed up the surveillance and records far faster than anticipated, and the picture was uglier than anyone guessed. The branch manager who greenlit the withdrawal was my father's old fishing buddy. Standard protocols, 2 separate verifications, had been skipped because the manager took Dad's word that he had authority. No paperwork, no recorded consent, nothing. Beth said this cracked open a much larger can of worms. The bank itself could now be on the hook. The shift was immediate. Their lawyer reached out the very next day, tone stripped of bravado, asking meekly whether we'd consider full repayment plus damages in return for mutual silence. Beth declined on our behalf. She informed them we would see them in open court, and then she phoned a journalist friend. 2 days later, the story hit the local news site, anonymized but unmistakable. After flood destroys home, grandparents drain granddaughter's college savings for jet ski. Within half a day, the article racked up 10,000 views. My phone buzzed with texts from people I hadn't seen since high school. My parents went dark. No posts, no calls, no surprise visits. For the first time since this began, quiet felt like victory. It didn't last. 3 mornings after the piece went viral, Beth rang with the update I never expected. The bank, desperate to contain fallout, offered a settlement that dwarfed anything we'd demanded. The original $15,000 would be wired immediately, plus $10,000 in direct damages from the bank, plus an internal probe that threatened the manager's job, and possibly more. It was over. The money was whole again, and then some. But the ripples kept spreading. That evening, word filtered through back channels that my father had been called in for questioning. Not handcuffs yet, but close. Someone inside the bank had flagged years of exceptions granted to connected customers. My dad's transaction, because it had been contested, became the loose thread that unraveled the sweater. Falsified signatures, skipped audits, potential fraud charges looming for both him and his old friend the manager. When my mother learned this, she returned to my brother's house pale and shaking, no baked goods this time, begging to speak with me. My brother blocked the doorway and told her all communication would go through Beth. Later that night, I stepped into the living room and found my daughter on the carpet teaching her little cousins an old clapping rhyme from elementary school. Her smile was wide and unguarded. She glanced up and said, "Mom, this is what a real family feels like." Something broke open in my throat. I fled to the porch, sat on the top step, and stared at the stars until my brother joined me, pressed a cold soda into my hand, and murmured, "They're not climbing out of this one." I couldn't answer. I no longer knew what recovery looked like for people like them. The next morning, Beth confirmed every detail: settlement signed, funds transferred, manager suspended, criminal referral filed. She asked if I wanted to add emotional distress claims against my parents personally. I told her yes. I wanted the ugliness documented in black and white under my name for the rest of time. Then the strange pilgrimage began. At first, just my mother, cruising slowly past the house. One day, she left a bouquet propped against the mailbox as if we'd died. Then Dad started appearing too, parked across the street for hours, engine idling. They escalated to anonymous food drops, casseroles, Tupperware lasagna, cellophane-wrapped cookies, left on the porch like offerings to angry gods, never lingering long enough for confrontation. My brother tossed every container untouched into the trash. On my brother's next birthday, we held a small party. Cupcakes, balloons, co-workers, normalcy. Someone knocked mid-celebration. My brother opened the door to find our parents standing there empty-handed. They stepped inside uninvited, walked through the stunned guests, and sank to their knees in the middle of the living room rug. My mother choked out that she was sorry. My father looked straight at me and said he hadn't realized how deep the damage went. The room froze. Rage and pity warred inside me, but I stayed silent. My brother met my eyes. I gave the slightest nod. He told them we forgave them. They wept. We did not truly. After that theatrical apology, they seemed to believe the slate was wiped clean, that kneeling once erased everything. Mom began dropping off board games allegedly unearthed from the attic. Dad emailed lists of scholarships and a condescending article called 10 Tips for the College Bound. They weren't monsters. That was the cruelest part. Just chronically self-centered people who tallied love like a balance sheet. My daughter, meanwhile, blossomed. She got her own library card, learned to ride without training wheels alongside her cousins, filled journal pages again. The perpetual flinch she'd carried in her shoulders vanished. Then one day, a thick handwritten envelope arrived in my brother's mailbox. Dad's stiff block letters, 3 pages of explanations and regrets, ending with a cashier's check for $8,000 made out to me. I slid it into the folder with the court filings and did not cash it. They kept orbiting. Groceries appeared. A tiny succulent with a note from my daughter's desk. A framed photo of me at age 6 standing by the lake, captioned on the back, "You were always our sunshine." We closed on our own small house the first week of October. Older, weathered, imperfect, but ours. When my daughter twirled in the empty living room and declared, "This one is really ours," the word ours finally felt solid. My parents discovered the move days later. Mom left a breezy voicemail of congratulations. Dad showed up alone holding a battered box of childhood photo albums and a short letter admitting he had failed to protect me when it mattered most, that watching my daughter cry that morning had haunted him ever since. He left without asking to come inside. A full year after we fled their house for good, we gathered again for my brother's birthday. Backyard barbecue, trampoline, too much cake. Toward dusk, my parents slipped through the side gate unannounced. They carried nothing. They walked to the center of the yard, past the staring guests, and once again lowered themselves to their knees on the grass. Dad looked at my brother and said, "You were right about everything." Mom whispered she hadn't understood the harm she'd caused. My brother hauled them up, repeated that we forgave them. I stood clutching my daughter's hand and nodded, but the nod was not forgiveness. It was the quiet click of a lock sliding home on a door that should never have stayed ajar so long. We stayed until the stars came out. On the drive home, my daughter drowsed against the window and murmured sleepily, "We're really okay now, right?" I reached over, smoothed her hair, and answered, "Yes, baby. We really are."